Before Europe knew about America, millions of people lived on the other side of the world. They had cities, armies, temples, and roads. But one mistake, one man's mistake, changed their destiny forever. In this video, you'll discover the untold truth about Columbus, why he wasn't actually searching for America and had no idea he had found it. You'll learn why his daring expedition was labeled insane, who took the risk of giving him ships, and what he witnessed when he first stepped onto the shores of the new continent. We'll also reveal how his journey sparked wars, unleashed deadly epidemics, and led to the disappearance of entire civilizations. This story is not only about geography. It is a story about how greed, faith, and curiosity can rewrite the map of the world and the destinies of millions of people. Before it all began, before Europe even uttered the word America, it already existed, not as an empty land or a nameless continent waiting to be discovered, but as a complex, living world inhabited by tens of millions of people. It had its own civilizations, its own empires, and its own laws. In the north, in the valleys of the future United States, lived tribes who built earthen mounds as tall as multi-story buildings. They traded, grew crops, and had rituals that were preserved for centuries. Further to the south, Mayan cities rose with hieroglyphs on the walls, temples and star maps on stone slabs. On the plateau of Mexico, an empire of Aztecs grew, with markets where thousands of people gathered daily, with an army, palaces, schools, a water supply system, and laws written down by crime category. And even further south, in the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire developed without writing, but with an ideal network of roads, an accounting system on knotted cords, and centralized management that covered thousands of kilometers. America before Columbus is not a myth about wild tribes. These are living societies in which people got married, quarreled, prayed, fought, and healed. Each nation had its own gods, its own legends, and its own explanations of the structure of the world. They were not the same. Some believed in the kingdom of the dead underground, somewhere in the connection with animals, somewhere in the Great Sunday. But they were similar in one thing. None of them knew that beyond the ocean there was another world unknown to them. But Europe knew, or at least guessed. In the imagination of a medieval European, the world ended either at the sea or a wall of sand, at best a cliff with monsters and black winds. But closer to the 15th century, the fear of the horizon gradually began to give way to interest. It all started in the East. In the Middle Ages, the East was synonymous with wealth. Pepper, cinnamon, silk, jade, sugar, and porcelain were brought to Europe from India and China. But the journey there was long and dangerous. Caravans crossed dozens of borders where each ruler set his own duty. After the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire, this route became almost inaccessible. The Portuguese, obsessed with the idea of going around Africa, spent decades paving the way along its coast. They built trading posts, went further and further south, hoping to one day turn east and reach India. It was a path of real calculations through the spit, monsoons, harbors, and dangers. It required patience and money. But there was another thought, bolder and less proven. What if the Earth is round and the route to India lies not to the east, but to the west? It seemed crazy. Many scientists really believed the Earth to be a sphere, but believed that the ocean between Europe and Asia was too big. However, there were those who believed that there was not so much water between Europe and Asia, and maybe there was land somewhere there. In those years, legends circulated in Europe about wonderful islands beyond the horizon, about the land of saints, about golden cities where the roofs were covered with jewels and the rivers were full of spices. They talked about Saint Brendan, who allegedly sailed across the ocean and reached Eden. There were stories about Vikings who once found themselves in Vinland, a rich land beyond the sea. These rumors were not perceived as a map, but fed the imagination. The less knowledge there was, the stronger the myths were. They did not hinder, but on the contrary, pushed forward. When there are not enough facts, fear is replaced by hope. Inside this hope lived the idea that the ocean can be crossed, that on the other shore there will be earth, that it is possible not to perish, but to get rich. At this point, fear and greed began to work together. Fear of being cut off from sources of goods, to remain on the sidelines of world trade, greed to get access to all this directly without intermediaries, and there was also vanity. Whoever has their own trade route will become the strongest power. Curiosity, greed, fear, and legends came together. Someone was looking for gold, someone wanted to find the borders of the world, and someone wanted to prove that the horizon is not an obstacle. So there was a request for a map that did not exist yet. First in mines, then in papers, then in ports, and finally in sails. Everything that happened next was a consequence of these expectations, guesses, illusions, and faith that beyond the horizon there is not emptiness, but opportunity. An opportunity to see what is not visible from here. An opportunity to be the first to reach the shore whose name no one knows. And while on the other side of the ocean, people were harvesting, hunting, praying, and making sacrifices to their gods, in Europe, the first expedition of Mira was already being prepared. They did not yet know about each other, but soon their clash would change both of them. At the end of the 15th century, Europe was on the threshold of a new stage. In Spain, the Reconquista had ended, the last Moorish fruit. Granada had surrendered. The Catholic monarchs, Isabella Kostilska and Ferdinand of Antergon, had finally united the country, cleared the treasury, and started thinking about the future. That same year, a man who had been trying to convince kings of one idea for many years appeared again at the Spanish court. The way to India can be found if you sail west. His name was Christopher Columbus. He was born in Genoa to a simple weaver. In his youth, he went to sea, worked as a merchant, studied maps, and drew navigation charts himself. He did not have a university education, but he had a rare tenacity. His idea was essentially based on a mistake. He greatly underestimated the size of the Earth and did not know that between Europe and Asia, there was a whole continent. But he believed that if you leave Spain and keep a course strictly to the west, you can sail to the shores of Asia. At first, he was ridiculed. His ideas were rejected. In Portugal, England, and France, he was not even listened to. Only in Spain did he find support. A monk named Juan Perez played a key role, persuading Queen Isabella to give Columbus another chance. She agreed. A contract was signed. Columbus received the title of admiral, the right to rule future lands, and a share of all the riches he found. In May, preparations began. 3 small ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, were moored in the port of Polos de la Frontera. They were modest in size, without much protection, and not designed for a long ocean voyage. The crew was hard to find. People were afraid. There were rumors that there was emptiness beyond the horizon, a cliff, monsters, magnets that could pull nails out of planks. In the end, the team was finally assembled. Most did not follow the call of their hearts. Some went to avoid prison, others because they were promised forgiveness or money. The sailors did not know exactly where they were sailing. They were told, to India. But the map they were following was just a guess. No one had crossed this route before them. On the morning of the 3rd of August, 1492, the flotilla set out to sea. The farewell was short. No salutes or songs. No one believed that they would return. At first, the course took them to the Canary Islands. There, they replenished their supplies and repaired the Pinta. Her rudder broke before leaving Spain. Then, they went out into the open ocean. This was the part of the journey that no one knew. With each passing week, the horizon remained empty. The wind did not change. The sun carried heat. The people began to get nervous. Many began to write down the days on the walls. Some asked to turn around. Columbus kept a diary, but he wrote down underestimated distances so that the crew would think that they were not so far from home. Every night they peered into the sky, but there was no indication that the path was right. Not a single familiar shore and not a single oncoming boat. Sometimes birds would land on the water, sometimes seaweed would float to the surface, Columbus would say, "This is a sign, land is nearby." But the land never appeared. One day, strange lightning appeared in the sky. In the evening, the compass began to behave differently. The needle would deviate. Some thought they had lost their way, that the world beyond had already begun to collapse. One of the sailors said that perhaps the ocean was endless. Columbus was silent, but inside he doubted too. A month later, the unrest became obvious. The sailors began to talk about mutiny. The people were tired. They did not understand where they were. They had no map, only the captain's faith and the silence of the ocean. Columbus promised that if there was no land in a few days, they would turn back. And yet, on the 10th of October, birds began to circle more often above the ships. On the morning of the 11th of October, branches and tree fragments appeared on the water. And at night, around 2 o'clock, a cry rang out from the watch. Land. They did not know what exactly they had found. They did not know that this was not Asia at all. But for them, this was the end of the road. They had crossed seas that were not on any map and now stood before the shore that would forever change the course of history. On the morning of the 12th of October, as the sun slowly rose above the horizon, Columbus's 3 ships approached the shore of an unknown land. The watchman of the Spinta was the first to notice a shadow on the water. Then he made out the silhouettes of trees. Columbus ordered to lower the boats. He was in full dress uniform with the flag of Castile, with a letter from the Queen, and with the thought that he had reached Asia. They landed on one of the Bohemian islands. The name that the locals gave, Columbus wrote down as Guanahani. He did not understand their language, but this did not bother him. He was sure that this was one of the islands off the coast of India. Later, he would write in his diary that the island was inhabited by kind people, meek without weapons and easily submissive. On that first day, Columbus raised the flag of Spain, declaring these lands the property of the Catholic monarchs. He did not ask the locals whose lands they considered the island. He believed that he had arrived in the lands that he was destined to discover and take under his control. The natives came to the shore. They had no metal, no clothes in the usual sense. They offered gifts, feathers, beads, and food. They did not understand who these people with white skin and iron things were, and certainly did not know that with their appearance, everything would change. Columbus took their gesture as a sign of recognition of power. He decided that they were Indians because he thought he was in India. This name would stay with them forever, despite the geographical error. In the following days, the flotilla moved from island to island. They were looking for gold. Columbus was not interested in the climate, nor the culture, nor the customs, but in where the mines were, where the jewelry was mined, and what people wore jewelry. He asked questions, pointed to objects, drew with gestures. They answered him, but he understood them freely. On one of the islands, he met people who had small gold pendants. They explained that further to the south, there was a land where there was even more gold. Columbus remembered this. He wrote down, "If these people know gold, then there is a lot of it here. If they do not resist, then they can be converted to Christianity and used in the economy." His first impression of the locals was ambivalent. On the one hand, he wrote that they were hospitable, open, unarmed. On the other, that they could easily be made servants and taught Spanish. He saw them not as allies, but as a resource. Meanwhile, the crew was getting used to the new shores. They tried local fruits for the first time, encountered plants they did not know for the first time. There was tobacco, there were potatoes, there were parrots, palm trees, and heat they were not accustomed to. Many were surprised and at the same time felt fear. He land stretched before them beautiful, yet shrouded in mystery. Columbus wrote in his journal, "No dangerous beasts, no cities, no armies." But he was wrong. He had not yet reached the places where powerful civilizations thrived. Standing at the very edge of a vast continent, he believed he had already reached its heart. In his mind, all was under control. The natives recognized his authority, and the mission was nearing success. Yet in truth, he understood nothing, neither their language, nor their political order, nor the deep faiths that bound their people together. He did not know this was only the first step. Ahead lay the islands of the Caribbean, and beyond them a mainland with a history stretching back 1,000 years. A world far more intricate than it appeared from the deck of his ship. The voyage pressed on. In November, the ships reached Cuba. Columbus was certain it was the mainland. He dispatched a party inland, seeking palaces and temples. They found neither, but returned with tales of an extraordinary plant the locals smoked. Leaves, dried and rolled into tubes, set aflame. For the first time, Europe learned of tobacco. Next came Hispaniola, the island that today is divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Here, Columbus chose the site for the first European settlement in the New World. Before his very eyes, Santa Maria ran aground and broke apart. From its wreckage, they built a fort. A few dozen men stayed behind. This was the first European colony in the Americas. Columbus, with the rest of his crew, set sail back to Spain. In his possession, a little gold, some exotic objects, several captured natives, and most importantly, the news. He believed he had reached India, that the route was now open, and that trade could begin. In his letters, he spoke of wondrous lands, kind people, and a great mission. What he did not know was that his first steps had laid the foundation for a long chain of invasions. He did not know that after the first gifts would come the cannons, and after the missionaries, the soldiers. He did not know that for these islands, this was not a discovery, but the beginning of the end. Illusions and gold. When Columbus returned to Spain in the spring of 1493, he was at the center of attention. He was greeted as the man who had opened a new route to India, though in truth, he had not fully understood where he had been. His ship docked in ports with cages on deck and side, men with dark skin and feathers in their hair. In the holds were baskets of maize and cotton, glittering stones, strange fruits, and bright parrots. Yet it was the gold ornaments, few though they were, that drew the most attention. The royal court received him with honors, calling him Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and his tales were retold with admiration. He reported that he had found numerous islands, rich in nature and ready to be brought into the Christian faith. He swore that the gold in these lands far exceeded the small amount he had brought back. If only he were given more ships and more men, he promised, he would uncover inexhaustible wealth. Isabella and Ferdinand believed him. His promises matched their hopes. Power, wealth, glory. All of it seemed within reach. They authorized him to mount a second voyage. But now, things were different. The first time, he had sailed with 3 modest ships. This time, he commanded a fleet of 17 vessels and more than 1,000 people aboard. Among them were not explorers, but craftsmen, soldiers, officials, and priests. This was no longer an expedition, it was colonization. They set sail in the autumn of 1493. Soon, they reached Hispaniola, where the garrison had been left behind. But the fort, built from the wreckage of the Santa Maria, lay in ruins. Those who had stayed were dead. The reasons remain uncertain. Perhaps a quarrel with the local inhabitants, perhaps an internal dispute. Columbus resolved to begin again. He founded a new settlement, La Navidad, then another, Isabella. He tried to establish administration, assert control, and organize gold extraction. But there was little gold to be found. What the locals wore as ornaments had nothing to do with real gold deposits. Columbus sent parties deep into the island and gathered information, but there were no great discoveries. Yet he kept believing, or at least pretending to believe, in mountains of gold. He began to use force. He set quotas for gold collection, demanding that the islanders bring him a certain number of grains. For those who failed, there was punishment. The first chains appeared, the first hangings, the first uprisings. Meanwhile, in Spain, expectations grew. They waited for results, for gold, for ships laden with treasures. Instead came reports of disorder, of poor governance, of cruelty. Complaints multiplied. Among the settlers, discontent was rising, food was scarce, disease spread, discipline collapsed. Columbus could not cope. He was a navigator, not an administrator. He did not know how to govern a colony, how to resolve conflicts, how to build lasting relationships with the local peoples. He believed that if he found gold, all problems would be solved. He was wrong. He sailed on, exploring new islands. He reached Jamaica and part of Cuba. Everywhere, he searched for signs of India, for spices, for exotic scents. He asked the locals if they had a king, if they had elephants, if they had peppers. They did not understand what he was asking, and he did not understand that he was in a completely different world. Despite the chaos, in 1496 he returned to Spain once again, this time without triumph. Rumors trailed behind him of brutality, executions, and failure. He was still received, but now with restraint. His authority had begun to crack. Yet he pleaded, "Give me another chance." He promised to find again what had never been there. The third expedition, 2 years later, brought Columbus to the shores of South America to the mouth of the Orinoco River. There, for the first time, he began to suspect that perhaps he was not in Asia after all. The river was far too mighty, the plants too unfamiliar, the people too different. In his letters, he wrote, "I feel that this land is part of paradise." But publicly, he did not abandon his theory. He could not admit he was wrong. Meanwhile, on Hispaniola, the crisis deepened. Spaniards demanded power, the local people rebelled, and complaints went straight to Madrid. In the year 1500, the monarch sent an official with a special order to arrest Columbus and bring him back to Spain. He was put in chains, thus ended his rule over the colony. He was freed, but never again received true support. In 1502, he set sail once more, his final voyage. He reached the shores of Central America, searching for a passage to the Indian Ocean, still clinging to the hope that his theory was right. He found no passage, no gold, and founded no cities. Storms battered his ships. He spent months in isolation, waiting for rescue. In 1504, he returned to Spain, old, sick, deceived by his own illusions. He asked for the return of his promised titles and shares, but Queen Isabella had died, and King Ferdinand no longer listened. Columbus died 2 years later, never knowing that he had not opened a new route to Asia, but had discovered an entirely new continent. His life became the symbol of the double-edged beginning of a new era. He sought spices and palaces, but found wild shores. He promised gold, but brought violence. He thought he held the map, yet stood on foreign soil without a compass. And yet, his journey became the starting point. Ahead lay conquistadors, plagues, ships, wars, treaties, and colonies. But the first to step onto this stage was a man who sought one thing, found another, and never understood what it truly was that he had discovered. The third expedition, 2 years later, brought Columbus to the shores of South America, to the mouth of the Orinoco River. The discovery of America did not simply become a consequence that no one had thought of. It was a new line in navigation logs. It triggered a chain reaction that no one had predicted. What started as a search for a route to India turned into a complete restructuring of the world. Geography changed its outline. Maps were rewritten. But most importantly, the very logic of history changed. After Columbus's return, a race began. Following the Spaniards, the Portuguese, English, and French rushed to the New World. Some came with royal decrees, others with personal greed. Some wanted gold, others land, and others souls. Each needed their own, and everyone believed they had the right to it. Spain quickly divided the world in half. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed. According to it, everything west of an imaginary line went to Spain, and everything east went to Portugal. The local inhabitants were not asked about it. They did not participate in the negotiations. Their existence was considered a part of the natural landscape, like forests, rivers, and ores. Settlements began to grow in the Caribbean islands. Each new governor promised more income. Gold became the goal, the meaning, the measure. Where it was not found, people were forced to work. Where it was found, they were killed for refusing to share. Local communities were destroyed. Some fled, others fought, and some surrendered. but none of these strategies saved them. Following Columbus, others followed. Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico in 1519. He had just over 600 soldiers. The Aztecs had a mighty army, a capital, rituals, walls, and temples. Yet Tenochtitlan fell. Why? Because the Spaniards were brutal? Yes, but also because they had weapons. However, the main reason was that with them came something no one expected. Viruses, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus diseases that were unknown in the New World. The indigenous people had no immunity. One infected person could lead to thousands dying. Sometimes entire villages disappeared within weeks. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was an epidemic hidden in the fabric and breath of the conquerors. According to historians, by the mid-15th century, the population of the Caribbean islands had decreased by 90%. While this was happening, ships with trophies were heading to Europe. Bars of gold, exotic fruits, shells, tobacco, and indigenous people in chains. The world in the Old World eagerly absorbed everything new. Oranges and corn became commonplace. Potatoes entered the diet of the poor. With this came the belief that at the edge of the world lay an inexhaustible resource. Spain became the first global empire. Gold from America filled its treasury, but along with it came conflicts, corruption, and religious intolerance. Churches were built on conquered lands, but beside them were camps. Forced Christianization occurred. Those who refused to be baptized became slaves. The encomienda system allowed the Spaniards to care for the locals while gaining the right to their labor. In fact, this was a form of slavery. Soon, there were not enough indigenous people left. This led to the next phase, the importation of Africans. Slaves were brought across the Atlantic, sending back sugar, tobacco, and gold. Thus, the Triangle of Death was formed: Europe, Africa, America. But even those who did not participate in the conquest directly felt the changes. In England, a navy was being built. In France, trading companies were being established. New markets, new spices, new diseases, and new beliefs were emerging. The world economy began to form not in theory, but on the decks of ships. And what was happening in America? There, languages were disappearing, temples were collapsing, and manuscripts were burning. Where cities once stood, there were now pastures. People who had lived by their own laws for centuries suddenly became subjects of a foreign king. Their gods were forbidden, and their bodies were not their own. The conquistadors who came after Columbus no longer portrayed themselves as explorers. They came as conquerors. They had manifestos, bulls, and charters. They referenced God, but acted in the name of gold. Each sought to become a new Columbus, not in geography, but in profit. In Europe, his name became a symbol of victory. In America, a symbol of death. Discovery turned out to be not a doorway to a new era, but a blow to the jaw for those who already lived on this land. And it all began with a map that did not exist, with the idea that India was closer than it seemed, with the illusion that the Earth was simply a globe with edges. But it turned out that the Earth consists of living people, and the discovery of their lands is not a neutral act, but an invasion. Columbus did not know what he had started, but his step became the first in a series of events from which we still cannot cleanse ourselves. Because history is not only what is recorded in diaries, it is also what has been consumed, erased, and forgotten. And in the case of America, it is millions of voices that will never be heard again. With each passing decade after the first landing on the island of Guanahani, the significance of the name Christopher Columbus became increasingly symbolic. His real life, with all its failures, appeals, exiles, and losses, was gradually displaced by the image of a hero who discovered the New World. His journey was portrayed as a moment of triumph for the European spirit of courage and faith. But was this really the case? Columbus died in poverty and obscurity. His titles were stripped from him, and his income was cut. His sons fought with the crown for many years, demanding the return of what was promised. He never knew that he had discovered a new continent. Until the end of his life, he claimed to have found a route to East Asia. However, what he did not understand during his lifetime became the foundation of an historical myth. After his death, in the 15th and 16th centuries, when Europe was shaping its worldview, Columbus's figure became convenient. One man, one voyage, one date. It appeared clear, straightforward, and impressive. The discovery of the continent was reduced to a single name. The complex reality in which millions of people already lived in America did not fit into this convenient scheme. There was no place for the Mayans, Inca, Cherokee, or Mohawks. Their history was too turbulent, too contradictory. It was easier to disregard them and elevate Columbus's figure. In American schools in the 19th century, Columbus was presented as the founder. In his honor, cities, states, and universities were named. In 1792, 300 years after his first voyage, the first monuments were established in the United States. In the 20th century, Columbus Day became an official holiday. Discussions about the fact that he did not discover empty land, but entered it without permission, were seldom held. However, as time went on, by the early 21st century, the myth began to crack. Historians started asking questions. Why do we say discovered when millions of people had lived here before? Why do we celebrate the date that marked the beginning of the destruction of entire nations? Why do we ignore the consequences, calling this event exclusively great? In Latin America, Columbus Day was renamed in some countries to Day of Resistance of Indigenous Peoples. In some places, it was completely abolished, and in others, it was replaced with Day of Cultural Diversity. People began to reconsider their views. Monuments became a matter of debate. Some saw them as a reminder, while others viewed them as a symbol of injustice. But the issue is not just Columbus himself. He became a facade onto which the meaning of the era is projected. He is like the cover of a book that very few open. Columbus sought one thing, found another, and understood a third. However, his journey marked the beginning of a global exchange that changed climate, economy, agriculture, religion, and demographics. Europe received potatoes, corn, tomatoes, chocolate. America received diseases, slavery, iron, and the gospel. All of this did not happen in one day or one decade, but it began when 3 ships came close to the shore. Therefore, the question is not whether Columbus was a hero or a villain, but why we continue to tell this story as if it were simple. Why do we seek an unequivocal meaning in it? Why do we continue to call it a discovery, knowing that it cost someone their life, land, and name? History does not have to be comforting. Sometimes it is harsh, sometimes cruel, and sometimes illogical, but it is ours. And to understand how we arrived at where we are today, we need to see not only the heroes, but also those who have disappeared from the pages of textbooks, not only the path of the ship, but also the trace it left on the shore.